And within half an hour, the Evening Standard, London's main evening paper, ran with the headline, "Pressure mounts on Theresa May as university czar confesses to being porn addict." I've been very sorry to see the way in which you've been mobbed, and it's really reminiscent of what happened to me.
Hello, everybody. I'm here tonight with Toby Young. I'm sure many of you know all about Toby. He's a British journalist, associate editor of Quillette in London. And Toby was deplatformed, depersoned by a mob attack in 2018. And he's now started a new organisation called the Free Speech Union, which really interests me. And I thought you'd want to hear about that as well. Hello, Toby.
Hi, Bettina.
Very happy to have you here. And I'm particularly interested in what happened to you, how your trial by media actually started. Can you tell me what led to that?
Yeah, well, it all began at 1 minute after midnight in 2018, so at the very beginning of the year. The Guardian, Britain's most liberal newspaper, ran a story on its website saying that I had been appointed to help lead the government's new universities regulator. Now, this wildly exaggerated my importance. I'd been appointed as one of 15 non-executive directors to the board of the Office for Students, a new universities regulator in England. But because for some reason the government's press release, not only announcing my appointment, but announcing the others too, had been embargoed until midnight, as things, often are. The Guardian interpreted this as the government trying to slip kind of controversial news under the radar. And so the kind of Twitterati decided that they weren't going to let the government get away with these underhand tactics. And immediately I started trending on Twitter with people explaining why I was a completely unsuitable person to be appointed to this board.
Why were you so annoying to them?
Well, partly because I'm a conservative, partly because I'm male, pale, and stale, all the usual reasons. Partly because I've been involved in education since about 2009. I helped set up one of England's first free schools, what are called charter schools in the US, and had ended up co-founding 4 of them, but was, am an outspoken critic of progressive dogma in education, both in schools and in higher education. So I was considered, by the education sector, and particularly the higher education sector, which, as you know, has been completely captured by the woke cult in the United Kingdom and in Australia. I was considered, an ideological enemy. So they were absolutely determined that I wouldn't have any role overseeing the sector. And it's very unusual for any conservatives to be appointed to regulators, to the boards of regulators. I was one of 3 appointed to the Office for Students out of 15. The chair was a former advisor to Tony Blair. Even under a conservative government, appointing genuine conservatives to public bodies is almost unheard of. So that was also something that lots of people were unhappy about. And so the offence archaeologists went to work and immediately started sifting through everything. 7. So the first, exhibit A in the case for the prosecution against me was an essay I'd written about class in a collection of essays edited by Boris Johnson's sister, Rachel. She was a friend of mine at Oxford. Boris contributed to this book too. It was called The Oxford Myth. It sunk without a trace when it was published in 1987, but has been resurrected since by offence archaeologists, poring over Boris's contribution as well as mine. So, something I'd written 31 years earlier was dredged up and held against me. And, people quote mine, things I'd said.
What I really like, Toby, is the Confessions of a Porn Addict. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so so Exhibit B in the case for the prosecution, I wrote this piece for The Spectator in was appointed to this regulator, and it was about I sung the praises of this obscure program on a satellite channel now defunct called Men and Motors, in which kind of glamour models, topless girls, draped themselves over kind of sports cars. And it was, it went out at about 2 a.m. No one watched it. It was, on a part of the dial no one went to on their TV set. Anyway, I praised this program in this Spectator piece. And the sub-editor, who was a friend of mine, put at the top of the piece, "Confessions of a Porn Addict." Yeah. It was a gag, and I thought it was quite funny at the time. Didn't think anything of it. And then 17 years later, people started searching through the Spectator's digital archive, looking for things I'd written that they could then claim to be offended by. Someone found this piece, screen grabbed it, stuck it on Twitter, and within half an hour, the Evening Standard, London's main evening paper, ran with the headline, "Pressure mounts on Theresa May as university czar confesses to being porn addict." And it was as though, I'd been placed under the hot light the night before, and after sweating it out for half an hour, had eventually confessed to being a lifelong pornography addict. And I thought, God, it's so ridiculous. How can anyone take this kind of attack seriously? It's so obviously ideologically motivated. But of course, people did take it seriously. The Times followed up with almost exactly the same headline the following day, and the Times styles itself the paper of record. And someone started a petition demanding that I be sacked. That got 220,000 signatures. There was a pack of journalists permanently stationed outside my front door. So the pressure mounted.
Now I want you to tell us about one more example they dug up. I mean, this is the trouble, of course, if you've been in journalism, as you have, for 20 years or more, there's an awful lot they can take and twist and use against you. And my favorite was the story of the Red Nose Day tweet. Come on, Toby, tell us about that.
Even telling you about it, I'm still quite embarrassed by that.
I love it. I love it.
During Red Nose Day, which is an annual telethon organised by the BBC, in which they give over a night of programming to drawing attention to deprivation in the third world, in the developing world, and try and raise money. And they do. They raise a lot of money each year. I think this was in 2009 or 2010. There was one particularly harrowing film shown about starving kids in an African country, and a woman said on Twitter that she'd found it so moving and upsetting that she'd already got through 5 boxes of Kleenex. To which I responded, "Me too, haven't wanked so much in ages." And I didn't literally mean that I had been masturbating over pictures of starving children. I was taking the mickey out of this woman virtue signaling on Twitter. And that's the general tone, the kind of there's an overwhelming tone of virtue signaling kind of surrounding Red Nose Day. Everyone kind of conveying just how much they care in the most kind of emotional way. And it's difficult to object to because it's a good thing. It raises lots of money for very worthy causes, but sometimes, particularly after a couple of glasses of wine, you can't help but kind of be a little contrarian and sophomoric about it. Anyway, I couldn't. Stupid thing to do.
And is it true that Theresa May had to have this particular joke explained to her?
Well, the Mail on Sunday, Britain's, I think, second biggest selling Sunday newspaper, someone dug up this tweet. I think someone in the Labour Party press office or campaign headquarters dug up this tweet, sent it to the Mail on Sunday, and they called the number 10 Downing Street for a reaction, because at that time, I was still in post. Theresa May hadn't fired me. Yeah. And the headline on the Mail on Sunday was "Prime Minister's disgust at sordid tweet." But she hadn't actually read the tweet. It was just a kind of, stock reaction that was provided to the paper by Downing Street. And she was due to appear the morning the paper came out on MAR, which is a kind of flagship current affairs interview program on Sunday morning. And her press secretary, Robbie Gibb, or rather her communications chief, he realized about this tweet because it was on the front page of the Mail on Sunday. So in the green room, just before her interview, he actually read it out to her in case she was asked about it, so she'd know, what was being talked about. And he sort of read it to her, and she was like, "I don't get it." And so he then had to explain. I think what he means is that he had to use a similar number of Kleenex to mop up all the semen, Prime Minister. And she wasn't actually asked about it. I mean, it was a Sunday morning program, so it wasn't suitable. But yeah, that was one. I mean, it seemed extraordinary that something I had dashed off at 2 a.m. 10 years earlier should be being discussed by the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But
and we're joking about this, but it's actually deadly serious. Obviously, I like some of these stories and they're very funny, but I'm sure it wasn't funny at the time. I mean, it's actually devastating to have the media pile on you, dig for things to use, twisted sentences, cherry pick quotes, and presenting you in the worst possible light. I mean, I know you found that just really difficult to deal with.
Yeah, well, it's. I think no one who's, people who haven't been through a mobbing, imagine that it'll be easier to deal with than it actually is. If you take each individual instance of each individual attack, such as the attack over the Confessions of a Porn Addict headline, they seem almost comic in their absurdity. How could anyone really judge me an unsuitable person to serve in this very minor role, which incidentally is an unpaid position, just on the basis of a headline placed on a magazine article I wrote 17 years earlier. But the cumulative impact of people dredging all these things up, and they don't just dredge them up once, they dredge them up again and again. And every time they dredge them up, they present it as their kind of extraordinary sleuthing, having uncovered this kind of horrendous, kind of embarrassing fact about you, this compromising detail. I mean, it's a kind of torrent. And initially, I think you experienced the same, Bettina. When I mean, you're still going through this. At the beginning, you try and fight back. You respond. You kind of, you respond to each of the criticisms in turn, and you defend yourself. It's a natural human impulse. But after a few days, you realize that nothing you can say, nothing you can do, can stop this kind of torrent of disapproval, this tsunami of hate, and you go to ground.
And the terrible thing is that knowing people are believing this misinformation, this total distortion of your views, it's a really devastating thing.
It is. It's awful. It's as though I felt it was as though someone had. I was sitting at the wheel of a car, and that car was my life and my career. And this malignant demon kind of had appeared on the seat next to me, grabbed the wheel, and was now steering the car into the path of the oncoming traffic. And there was just nothing I could do. I was just now a passenger in this kind of unfolding slow motion car crash. And it didn't seem at all obvious what I could do to kind of regain control of this narrative. And it's, of course, that's extremely anxious making. One of the things.
Sorry, go on. I was just going to say, Toby, one of the things people constantly give you good advice. Oh, well, you should apologize for this. You should say, and I want you to tell people about the apology issue, which is terribly complex, isn't it?
I'll come to that in 1 second, but I just wanted to talk just about the how psychologically traumatic it is to find yourself at the center of one of these storms. I lost half a stone in the course of a week. Which, of course, in some ways is great. I remember calling it at the time the public humiliation diet. and maybe I will yet write a diet book about, if you really want to crash diet, this is actually an extremely effective way of losing weight. I think one of the reasons for that is, and this is quite common, I've met other people who've been mobbed, cancelled, and weight loss is a common side effect.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons, I think, is that you have this kind of primordial sense of this kind of mob chasing you through the forest, like the scene in Apocalypto, that great fried brain Mel Gibson movie. And it's like you're looking over your shoulder, and there's this kind of frenzied mob, kind of overcome with bloodlust, kind of chasing you, wanting to tear you limb from limb. And I think because it feels like that, you naturally kind of shed weight so you can run faster to get away from this mob who are pursuing you and want to kill you. So it's a kind of instinctive reactions to kind of shed weight. And so that happened to me. So that was actually.
Well, I must say, I lost plenty of kilos during the last month. Yeah, I know that.
One of the difficulties for me was I was also running this education charity at the time, and we had to submit an application for a large grant from the Department for Education, and I was having to kind of pull this kind of major piece of work together. It was the kind of one of my most important responsibilities was we were competing against lots of other similar organizations for this pool of money, and so having to kind of coordinate this kind of huge enterprise involving up to a dozen people feeding into this kind of document. So I was having to kind of work 12 hours a day on pulling this grant application together. And I also I have a journalism career. I have a weekly column for The Spectator, and I have a young family. I've got 4 kids, so I was having to kind of juggle all of this while contending with this kind of all my enemies. And the tough thing about it, as I'm sure you found, is that people that you thought you could rely on turn out to be unreliable. So people you hoped would be allies, people you hoped would come to your defense, don't, or they initially do, and then when they realize just how mobbed you're going to be, they then kind of start distancing themselves from you, and that makes it quite difficult too. You feel kind of increasingly isolated and alone, and you feel as though it's a bit like many of the groups that were coming after me style themselves great believers, upholders, warriors for social justice, but there's certainly nothing just about this kind of mob justice. And they also I was going to say one other thing about what's odd about it. They think of themselves as kind of the enemies of hatred, and portray you as a kind of hater, as someone, and many of the things I'd said supposedly, like about these starving children in Africa in my silly joke about Kleenex, that's hate speech. But nothing could be more a better illustration of a kind of outpouring of hate than what happens to you when you find yourself in one of these mobbings. I mean, you really are being othered. You're being kind of outcast. You're kind of being pushed out of the tribe and isolated, so you can be kind of ripped limb from limb, and no one has the slightest kind of qualm of conscience about doing that. You are an enemy. You are a member of the out group that threatens the in group. You need to be expelled and exterminated. And there was this kind of awful sense that kind of you were now on your own. You were kind of you were outside the kind of protective circle that protects ordinary people from kind of cruel and inhumane treatment. Anyway,
which is of course why people don't dare defend you. I mean, people watching this happening, I mean, you can't blame them for keeping their heads down. I mean, that's what's so terrifying about it.
Yeah, I spoke to one guy who initially did defend me, a public figure, and I was incredibly grateful for his initial defense. But then he changed his mind, and appeared on BBC Radio 4's flagship current affairs program, and said that I clearly wasn't a suitable person to be involved in education, and that my Twitter feed was just a kind of sewer of hatred.
Yeah.
And after it had all passed, I took him out for a drink, and I said, I was very happy that you defended me, but a little disappointed that you then completely changed your mind, which was actually worse than not having defended me at all. And he explained that the reason he changed his mind is because his children and his secretary kept flagging up all the attacks that he was attracting because he defended me. And some of them were quite vicious and personal. And he said that people close to him, his colleagues and members of his family, had found this really difficult. And so in the end, he decided to protect himself and protect them by just turning on me. I mean, he was pretty open about it. He just said, in the end, I put myself before you. I mean, fair enough, I suppose.
Fair enough. And the apology issue, I know you at one stage apologized for one issue, but you now felt that was a mistake. You ended up losing all your jobs, didn't you, despite your efforts to try to redeem the situation?
In the end, after 8 days of this, when it clearly wasn't going to go away, and whether or not Theresa May was going to fire me or not was kind of leading the news on a sort of daily basis, I thought I've really got no choice but to apologize and resign. And one of the reasons for doing that is I had these various other positions. I was involved in these other charities. I was an ambassador for one. I'd set up this charity that the 4 schools I'd co-founded sat within. If you are involved in various other organizations which are dependent on kind of political goodwill as well as public goodwill, you want to do whatever you can to protect them. And the academic charity I'd set up to house the various schools I'd co-founded, there were hundreds of employees, and they were all terrified about what the implications would be if I just sort of brazened it out and refused to apologize or resign. So you're under enormous pressure if in a situation like that. To do what you can to kind of draw a line under it and kind of protect all the other organizations and all the people that work for them that you're involved in. I stood down and I apologized for my, middle of the night sophomoric drunken tweeting. And I naively hoped that would draw a line under the whole affair and I could just get on with my life. But actually that was like throwing a kind of hunk of raw meat to a shoal of piranha fish. If you genuflect to the mob, that doesn't satisfy them. They don't think of that as having won. Rather, they think of that as you having shown weakness, which of course just kind of makes them even more frenzied and kind of cruel and malignant. And so they then went after me. The same people who'd gone after me in over the Office for Students job then went after all my other jobs and started mounting pressure. So, for instance, I was a Fulbright commissioner and had been for 4 years because I myself was a Fulbright scholar back in the late 80s, some people claiming to be former Fulbright scholars started writing letters. They started a Facebook group putting pressure on the board of the Fulbright Commission and the chair of the Fulbright Commission, saying this person is clearly an unsuitable person to be a Fulbright commissioner. Unless you fire him, we're going to withdraw our support for your fundraising activities and so on and so forth. So I had to step down from the Fulbright Commission, and this sort of repeated itself across the board. I ended up losing having to step down from 5 positions, including my full-time job running this education charity. So it was, I was well and truly cancelled. I was kind of cast out, not unpersoned, as you said. I was considered beyond the pale, someone who just wasn't fit to be involved in any charitable, any public activities at all.
But here you are. You've not only survived, you're going to bat. You're out there founding this new organization, the Free Speech Union, to try to help people who've been through that sort of situation and who are facing that sort of attack. Tell me what how you decided to approach this. I was interested. I read something you wrote about initially thinking about what the historian Neil Ferguson talked about. He what was it, a few years ago, he talked about a NATO of the pen, and the idea of getting academics and intellectuals to stand up for other intellectuals who are under attack. Mm-hmm. Anyway, you've got to explain what that was all about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Neil Ferguson, I think, wrote a column in the Sunday Times in the UK, saying that I think, citing various examples of academics and intellectuals who'd been cancelled. I think he cited Brett Weinstein, the evolutionary biologist who was effectively drummed out of his job at Evergreen State for was it Evergreen College? There was a day of absence at Evergreen, and every year I think normally the students of color on campus absent themselves from campus for the day to make a point about, they don't have enough visibility on campus. So to increase their visibility, they make the point of absenting themselves from campus for one day. But this particular year, the tables were turned, and the requirement was for everyone who was white to absent themselves from campus for one day. And Brett Weinstein, who describes himself as a democratic socialist, he's a Bernie Sanders supporter, so he is, a member of the progressive left and has been for decades. But he refused to do this. He thought this was absurd, and that he shouldn't have to do this. So he refused to comply with this kind of campus-wide edict, and as a result, he was mobbed by marauding groups of social justice warriors, literally wielding baseball bats on campus. And people who wanted to try and come to his classes were terrorized. He tried to engage in debate and conversation with some of the student activists leading this protest. They didn't want anything. They didn't want any part of that. They just wanted him gone. And in the end, he was advised that by the campus police, to leave the campus in order to protect himself and his wife and his family, because the police couldn't guarantee their safety. It was an extraordinary, terrible episode, and there have been numerous episodes like this, as I'm sure you know.
Sorry, Toby. I mean, he mentioned Jordan Peterson, various other people, Samuel Abrams, Peter Boghossian. I mean, there were a whole bunch of them that were mentioned in that particular article, weren't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were at least half a dozen cases he mentioned. He suggested that the solution was a kind of NATO for intellectuals, whereby if one was attacked, all would come to that person's defense. And so I started thinking about how to operationalize this. And that's where the idea for the Free Speech Union came from, a kind of non-partisan organization that stands up for the speech rights of its members in much the same way that trade unions stand up for the rights of workers in a particular sector. And I initially thought, and I wrote a piece for Quillette last year, setting out how I thought this would work, and sort of sending up the bat signals, saying, if anyone would like to help, please get in touch. Here's an email. Account on Gmail, jsmillssociety@gmail.com, that people could use to contact me to say they wanted to help, they wanted to try and make this work. And initially my idea was to confine it to people who are involved in the dissemination of ideas professionally. So not just academics and intellectuals and journalists, but also novelists, screenwriters, poets, comedians. We've seen dozens of comedians cancelled for being insufficiently politically correct or insufficiently woke. But the idea was anyone who makes a living from sharing ideas in some way, it would be for them. But I got contacted by so many people who said, look, I'm not involved in the professional dissemination of ideas, but nonetheless, my speech rights are in jeopardy. I said this at work last year. I'm in financial services because I challenged the idea that I'm suffering from unconscious bias, and because I drew attention to some of the skepticism about the implicit association test in the literature, I was deemed to be suffering from white fragility, and I was put on this course, and I was stigmatized at work, and I'm now worried I might be fired. And then there were lots of letters, lots of emails from people saying, my own speech rights aren't in jeopardy, but I really support this cause. I'd like to support it. I'd like to join. I'd like to help out in some way. So I thought, well, it's just crazy to try and confine it to a particular sector of society. Why not just make it anyone can join? Anyone who thinks their speech rights are in jeopardy or who cares about free speech can join. So I then broadened it, and lots of some of the people who contacted me had skill sets, like they were coders, they were lawyers, they were accountants, and so gradually I put the organization together with a kind of small team of collaborators, and last month we launched the Free Speech Union. And since its launch, it's been extraordinarily successful. I mean, I've been absolutely overwhelmed by the number of people who've joined, the number of people who've donated money. We've already got 2,600 members. We've raised six figures. We had our first board meeting last night, actually, and we're now beginning to set it up as a kind of proper grown-up company with various policies in place. And we've appointed an executive team, and I've already got involved in several campaigns. So extraordinarily, within a week of the Free Speech Union launching, two prominent speakers were no-platformed at Oxford University. In the space of it was like within a space of 5 days of each other, there were no platforms. So the first one was Selina Todd, who incredibly is the Oxford Professor of Modern History. She'd been invited to address this feminist conference at Exeter College, or an event commemorating the 50th anniversary of this women's liberation conference at Ruskin College in the 80s. She'd helped organize this event, she'd given a lot of support to the organizers, but she had flagged up to them when they first asked for her help, 5 or 6 months earlier, that some of the trans speakers they'd invited, or some of the trans activists they'd invited to address this conference, might object to her presence on the platform because she's a gender critical feminist. And they said, no, we want to hear from a multiplicity of voices within this movement. We're not taking sides in that particular debate. Don't worry. And so, having been given this assurance by them, she then threw herself into getting this event organized. She helped them book it at Exeter College. She enlisted the support of the Oxford history faculty. She found volunteers to help do some of the dog's body work. She actually raised some money to help put this event on. She publicized it with her friends and contacts in the media. I mean, she was instrumental in getting the whole event put on, staged at Exeter. And then at 7 p.m., I think, the night before this conference was due to take place, a group of the trans speakers, trans activists speaking at the event, said that if she was allowed to speak, they were going to withdraw. Now, the correct response when faced with a threat like that is to say, fine, withdraw. You don't get to dictate who's on the platform. But instead, all too typically, the organizers of this conference, who'd been unstintingly supported by Selina Todd in the sort of 4 months prior to this, immediately called her and said, sorry, Selina, we're going to have to cancel your these other people have threatened to withdraw, even though she'd warned them about this and they'd assured her that in these circumstances they would behave in exactly the opposite way. But of course, all too typically, they caved under pressure.
So how do you help Toby? So how do you help someone like her? What can you do?
Okay, what I've done is I wrote an official letter of complaint to the rector of Exeter College. That's the name they give to the kind of head guy, saying that this is a breach of Exeter College's code of practice when it comes to free speech. A day later, the rector then replied and said, "Thank you for your letter. We are going to investigate this under our official complaints procedure, and we hope to get back to you within 14 days."
You're talking about crowdfunding to help pay legal costs of people who do need to take legal action. Allies in the media to come to your defense if you're finding yourself being deserted by all your normal supporters. And legal assistance if you're punished by your employer because you said something that they don't agree with. So a whole range of measures you're talking about. And Toby, we're going to put all this information of how to look at the information about contacting the Free Speech Union below this video, so people will be able to know where to go. And I'm very pleased that you're finding yourself recruiting a lot of people to help with all of this. Toby, look, it's been great talking to you, and I'm sure many people listening to this conversation will want to get on board and help you with this extraordinary enterprise. Anyway, thanks for joining me.
Let me just say before I go, Bettina, that I've been very sorry to see the way in which you've been mobbed, and it's really reminiscent of what happened to me. Taking things you've said out of context, just inventing things about you out of whole cloth. The way in which so many institutional bodies, which really should know better and should maintain neutrality and should observe due process, the way they've just piled on, they've just joined in the dog pile, has been shocking. But it's exactly what happened in my case. And I just wanted to say that we will do everything we can to stand up for you. And I just want you to know that it is possible to get through this. At the time, it feels like, the end of the world. I remember looking at this headline on the front page of the Mail on Sunday and thinking, this is how I'm going to be remembered for this awful tweet I sent in the middle of the night. My kids, when they're trying to tell their kids who I was, they're going to look me up on Wikipedia, and this is the first thing they're going to read. And my reputation has been destroyed. My name has been taken from me, dragged through the mud, and it'll never recover. And it's an awful apocalyptic feeling. And people who've been through this, have ended up committing suicide. There've been at least half a dozen cases of people who've been mobbed in this way, ending up taking their own lives. But I just wanted to assure you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. The fog eventually lifts. Amazingly, people forget about this stuff almost as quickly as they get worked up about it. The mob moves on very quickly. And once it's moved on, they don't even look in the rearview mirror. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. Things do get better. In some ways, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm a better person now. And I'm a lighter person, importantly. I'm 2 stone light. So, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't quite got there yet, but we'll get there. Thanks, Toby.
Thanks, Bettina.
Thanks everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.